All right, everybody. I got a very, very special guest for you all this week. I want everyone to welcome Pornsak Pichetshote to the show. Welcome, Pornsak.
Hey, thanks for having me, man. Appreciate it.
Thank you for being on. I always appreciate creators coming on and talking. So, first of all, how you doing?
I'm doing all right. It's like I don't even know what day of the week it is anymore. It's a Monday morning, so it's the start of the week. And things seem to be okay. I've been slow on the rollout into like integrating with the world. So I feel like I'm starting to do that a little bit. Maybe not this week, but the next coming weeks, and I'm pretty excited about that because it feels like everyone's got a head start on me. So.
Yeah, it's been interesting watching. I went to a con a few weeks back, like a little local con, and
Okay, how was that?
It was fun. It was interesting. A lot smaller than I'm used to.
Okay,
Even for a
okay,
local con, like I still think a lot of people are still a little hesitant, but
yeah.
most people were doing, wearing the mask, doing their thing, and it was fun to talk to people and actually get out there.
So cool. That's so cool. Yeah, I heard Rose City went over well with all that. I wasn't there for that, and I'm really looking forward to hearing stories from Thought Bubble. I'm kind of regretting, and it gets like in a month's time there's New York Comic Con. Although I think a lot of the major publishers won't be there. I don't think Image is there this year. So I'm curious to hear the stories about conventions. Like I don't feel quite comfortable doing them yet, but I feel like it seems like things are going well, and then by next year, hopefully, I'll kind of get my sea legs back.
Yeah, some of the people I know went to Rose City, and I've been hearing great things about it. So,
That's so cool.
fingers crossed. We all want everything to go back to going to cons all the time. So
yeah,
but so let's start with what we always start with people. What's your origin story? What got you? I mean, what was the comic that kind of got you into comics, and then where along the line did you kind of join the industry?
Well, so I feel like I still remember my first comic. My first comic was Amazing Spider-Man number 230. It was the second half of Nothing Stops the Juggernaut. And so, and I bought that at a local sort of like convenience store. There's like 5 and 10 sort of stores. And then that slowly, I started picking up more comics. And then what I really started like following was Marvel Tales used to do for a while, did reprints of the original Stan Lee, Steve Ditko Spider-Man, and so the first 50 issues of Spider-Man they reprinted, and I loved all that stuff. And what was funny was like at the time that was when like the black costume and all that was sort of coming in like the regular Spider-Man books, and I was just like, no, this doesn't feel right. And so like I just love like old school Spidey, and that is the stuff that really sort of got me into comics. And then I think after that, it's funny. I moved to Thailand when I was 12, and it was like this really sudden move. Like my parents, like they told me and my sisters, like, "Hey, we're going to Thailand for a year," and we're like, "Okay," because you're young, you don't have much of a choice on that. It's like, yeah, okay. And then we moved, and then like 1 year became 2 years, and then 3 years, and then me and my sister were like, "Oh, we just like moved to Thailand." Like they just didn't want to deal with any like argument. So they just told us it was a year-long trip, but we live here now, and this is the thing. And I think part of like living at that time, and that was around the time where Thailand didn't have a ton of like American pop culture coming in. So I would grab whatever I could, and comics was like a cheap pop culture thing that I could get, because this was at a time where there would be one movie. It was like a kind of like a drive-in where once a week there would be one movie that would play on TV that if I tuned my radio to a certain station I could hear in English. But that was like it in terms of like American like culture, pop culture. And so the comics I would get, I would just like religiously read them back and forth and forwards and backwards. So I would know them inside and out, but then I would also but I also would know like all the creative teams behind all these books. And so that's kind of what got me. And then I came to America for college, and there were so many comics, and so I that I just really kind of got into a whole hog sort of after that. And then after that, comics was this thing that was the only thing I did for fun. Reading comics was the only thing I did for fun, like going to the store on Wednesdays. And I was kind of a short story writer, and I was working in film and doing freelancing film, and I had quit. Not really a day job, but I told myself that, like, I'm just going to try to live as a freelancer. I'm going to do that thing where you survive without a net to sort of see what happens. And I had just enough money in my bank account to stay like 1 month ahead of rent. And we're just going to see what happens for the next year or so. And then a couple months into that, because I was getting like gigs on like indie film sets as a script supervisor. And a couple months into that, a friend of mine emails me, and he was like, "Hey, I got this email from a friend, and they're looking for assistant editor for the editor-in-chief of Vertigo." And I don't know what any of those words mean, but I know you're a big comics fan, and you probably do. So you should apply. And I was just like, well, I'm not really looking for a full-time job. I want to do this whole thing without a net. But like the chance to meet Karen Berger was like, I was such a fan. So I was just like, I'll go just for the chance to meet Karen Berger. And I probably won't get the job because I'm not interested in the job. But I'll just go so I can say I met her. And I did. I met her. It was a really great interview. She brought me back for an editing test. The editing test went well. Brought me back for a second interview. The second interview went well. She offered me the job. And the whole time I was like, I don't know if I want this job. I really just wanted to freelance and write. But I kind of felt that like, I'd be sitting on the other side of the desk because I was a huge Vertigo fan, and all of my favorite writers like wrote for Vertigo. So like I could sit at the other side of the desk and like I could probably learn so much about like watching my favorite writers write and all that. And I was just like, sometimes I have to take like these 6-month temp gigs just to like pay the rent. So like maybe this is just like a year-long temp gig. I'll treat it that way, and then I'll leave after that, and then go back to writing and go back to filmmaking and all that. And my time in DC treated me really well. I was an editor for 7 years. That led me to get on Jeff Johns' radar, so that when he started the film and not even at the time it was a think tank to turn. This is 2011. This is a think tank to turn comics into other media, and he recruited me to be part of that think tank. And so I moved out here to LA to do that, and I eventually started up. Helped him start up the TV department over at DC, and then I eventually started to go off on my own to kind of like write television and comics, which is kind of what I always wanted to do. But like my time at DC was like this wonderful digression where I learned all this stuff and met all these great people, and really, I mean, I was always a comics fan, but I really fell in love with comics, like working in the industry.
So that think tank you work for, is that what eventually became what created like Arrow and all that stuff that we love today?
Yeah. So okay. I was very involved with the creation of Arrow and Flash and Gotham and Constantine on NBC and iZombie, and so like I was really sort of in the mix with all that kind of stuff.
That's really cool. So, what was the year that you got at Vertigo? So I can have a timeline.
Oh, God, that's a good question. I want to say like when I got out of Vertigo. Do you say?
No, when you started at Vertigo.
I want to say it was around like I think I was there from 2003 to around 2010. I think that was around when I was there.
Okay.
Because I feel like I want to say I started like a month before the Spider-Man movie came out, something like that.
Okay. And you weren't there at the end of Vertigo, right? You left a little bit before that.
I left. I mean, I'm trying to think. Was I still at DC at the time? When did Vertigo officially shutter? Well, no. Oh, that's right. Vertigo officially shuttered after I left, because that was after Mark Doyle was promoted already. And yes. So I was right. I had left DC entirely by the time Vertigo was kind of, they sunsetted Vertigo, as I say.
So when you were there, because I believe that's pre-New 52.
Yes.
Was there? Did you guys have some of the superhero characters like Swamp Thing in the fold?
We did. I actually was. There was a minute where I was working on one of the Swamp Thing reboots, and it got actually when I started. That was when Andy Diggle. I think I started like a year before Andy Diggle would write Swamp Thing for Vertigo, and then I actually at the time was working on a Swamp Thing kind of like not necessarily reboot, like it's just a new series of Swamp Thing with the writer China Mieville, and it was still early stages. We were getting it together and all that kind of stuff, and that would eventually get killed because they were integrating it to what we would learn would be like the new 52 and Flashpoint and all that kind of stuff.
So when you're there, I've always been interested in how DC decides like, yeah, Swamp Thing's Vertigo, not DC, but then it still crossed over the universe. Was there any conversations on that, or was that just kind of that's how it's been for 20 years now? So
Yeah,
we just do it.
exactly. It's all sort of legacy stuff, and then from there, it was a little bit of, you know, what characters are low enough on the radar that nobody cares about in the DC universe, and depending on people, like depending on who's working there at a some, or who's the head writer or who's a hot writer there at the time, that would be like, you know, in the 90s, no one cared about Human Target, and so like Peter Milligan could do a Human Target riff, and it would consider Vertigo. No one, you know, before Darwin Cook did New Frontier, no one cared about the Losers, and so that meant Andy Diggle and Jock could do a reboot of that, a revamp of that, and a lot of times, and so we would get pitches all the time, and a lot of times it would be sort of a little bit of a case by case, like, you know, anything that didn't fall into superhero land made it really easy for us to justify it, like Unknown Soldier, which I worked on. You know, Garth had already done a book on that for Vertigo, and because it's a war character, you know, I think a lot of us just figure like, oh, all the war characters, we get access to them because what are they doing with them in the DC universe?
Yeah. So okay, so we'll fast forward a little bit where you've done the TV stuff and everything. What kind of writing gigs did you do after that? After you helped Jeff Johns with all that stuff?
Well, so after I left sort of DC, you know, I didn't do any writing while I was at DC. Actually, that's not true. I wrote one issue of Flash, but I wrote a Green Arrow Industries issue, and that was just like a one-off. And that was kind of, at the time, it was like Jeff's way of getting to know us and getting to know what our creative instincts were. So he gave a couple of us like issues of Flashpoint tie-ins to write. But I didn't really write when I was with DC. I had a non-compete clause when I was at DC, and there was actually a thing that they had started around that time where like the employees of the company could not write for, you know, could not write for the company unless you were like Jeff Johns or Dan DiDio. Like you couldn't like write for the company. And so my entire time at DC, I didn't write. And so after I left, that's when I actually started writing. And I'm trying to think, like, I think when I'm pretty sure this is accurate. When I left DC, there was just like deafening silence in terms of job opportunity. Like that nothing was happening for like a couple of years, and I wasn't getting jobs. Nothing was getting offered. None of it. But I honestly now look back and like. I now look back and it's like the luckiest thing. I literally consider it one of the luckiest things to have ever happened to me. The fact that like I went a couple of years freaking out with no job offers, because it really, I had worked, you know, at DC for like 10 to 12 years at that point. And I was used to showing up and clocking in and clocking out. And I did not know how to really live like a freelancer. To me, being a writer was finding a new job where I could clock in and clock out on. So if I had gotten a job on, you know, name the show, Arrow or Flash or Example or whatever the case may be, I still had those muscles to do all that. And so it took me a while to learn like, oh, part of writing is being a freelancer. Part of being a freelancer is dealing with the entrepreneurial stuff. And that means jumping from job to job and figuring out what the next things to do is. And so I had this thing. So after like nothing happening for the longest time, two things happened like almost simultaneously. I applied for a Disney TV writing fellowship, and I got it. But then, and at the same time, I pitched what was going to be Infidel to Image, and or I should say, even at that point I had pitched it, but even before that, Infidel was an idea I'd had in my drawer, or my back pocket for a really long time. And I had thought, and because I had it for so long and because I was on a non-compete at DC, I just assumed it was a movie. It was a screenplay. And I had all these notes and I had outlines and all this sort of stuff for it. And I didn't know, and I had budgeted it out to like around $2 million, but I don't know how to raise $2 million. So I talked to a friend of mine who introduced me to a friend of his who was like a line producer on a bunch of like indie horror features. And I got dinner with him or lunch with him, and I asked him like how he does what he does. And he says like, oh, you should put a lookbook together. That'll, all these artists, it should be really easy for you. And after I left that lunch, I was kind of like, yeah, it's like just like putting a comic together. And then I was just like, well, why don't I just do this as a comic? Like, because at the same time, I had wanted to do a comic. I'd always planned to do a comic, but the idea I had for a comic became an idea for a TV pilot that didn't go anywhere. So then I had this thing where I really wanted to do a comic, but I didn't have an idea for a comic. And meanwhile, I had this like thing for a screenplay, but I had no way to sort of make it. And so like, why don't I do it as a comic? And part of the reason why I never did, and I hadn't done it for so long, is being at Vertigo, I had seen so many people take their screenplays they couldn't find an audience for and say, hey, can I make a comic book with this? And I just hated the whole idea so much. I stayed away from it. And the other thing was that, if you're looking at a horror movie script, and I did for horror movie scares, you build them for the screen. You build them with sound and all that kind of stuff in mind. I'd be like, I'd have to totally rewrite this if it was to be a comic. But then I got really excited. I was like, oh, I'd have to totally rewrite this. That means I have to like really study like how to do horror as a comic, and that actually sounds cool and fun. So, and that's to me when it's just like, yeah, let's make this a comic, and that's kind of when that light bulb hit. And then after that, I should say, I was like juggling the two things, TV and comics, and it was a weird thing where after my first job, I had the career I always wanted, which I thought I'd have to work in television for 7 years to do it. And it was literally because I had no other options that I did things not knowing if that would hit or not. And I almost instantly just got the career I wanted, where I'm doing both. I mean, I'm stressed out all the time, but I get to do both.
Well, it's a good stress, right?
It's a good stress. Yeah.
So real quick, what is Infidel for those who may not know?
The way I describe Infidel is that Infidel is sort of a haunted house story for the new millennium. It's about a Pakistani American Muslim woman and her multiracial neighbors who live in a New York apartment building that is haunted by racist ghosts. Or ghosts that feed off xenophobia is how I say it in a classy way on the book trade catalog. But it deals. So it's a classic haunted house story, but it deals with concepts of racism and xenophobia.
Okay. And what was the TV show you were working on at the same time?
That was Marvel's Cloak and Dagger for Freeform.
Okay, so you were working with the competition then.
Yeah. So I went over to the other side. It was really interesting. I made a bunch of friends over at Marvel.
How was that transition, going from basically building up what's become this like giant thing over at DC, and then jumping over and doing, I mean, a really good show, but something that was a little bit smaller over at Marvel?
Yeah, I mean, I loved it. To this day, and I'm still friends with a lot of the writers at Cloak and Dagger. It's one of the best writers' rooms I've worked in, and I'm friends with so many of the people there. And this is the thing, like this talk about just sort of like being super lucky, and like my first job in television was my dream job in television, and I didn't know the show existed before I got the show. But it was a genre show. It dealt with social issues. It was very character centric. The people were all lovely. The people were all super intelligent. And once I got there, I was just like, this is the show I've always wanted to work on. The show I always wanted to work on. And then Marvel's Entertainment went away, and like they went from having like 10 television shows on the air to like no studio left. And so I was like, oh, I gotta like find new work apparently. But it was great. And so for me, what I loved at the time, what I distinctly remember loving, was I was in that writer's room and I was learning. I was literally learning from every single person at that table, and like all these really cool things. And that was awesome. But then I could switch over in comics, and because I had such a comics background, I'm on the flip side of things, and I'm just kind of like, okay, I know, and I'd be telling like, the people I'm working with, like, listen, I know this is what all the big guys are doing, but there's 2 guys in Montana that are doing this. And that's the smarter way of how to market a book. So we're going to follow those guys, and we're not going to follow everything the industry is doing, because that's ass backwards. And we took chances, and they worked out in our favor. So it was great to be in a case where, on the one hand, in one medium, I got to experiment with ideas after using my experience and take chances that the big companies weren't. And then on the flip side, I got to just be a sponge and just learn like, what does this industry, and then I can pick and choose what makes sense and what doesn't. So it was a fantastic experience at the time.
For those who may not know, myself included, like, what is it like being in a writer's room like that? Are you guys literally just shouting ideas at each other, or?
I mean, yes, but it's usually in a focus directed way. So,
Yeah.
and that's kind of up to the showrunner, where he will sort of a good showrunner or a good, sometimes it's a co-EP, whoever's running the room. It's phrase is called running the room. Whoever's running the room at the time, and I've done it a few times. It's about how they guide the room of like what to sort of think about. So sometimes it could be, you know, if it's a blue sky kind of thing, it could. And this is one of the things our Cloak and Dagger showrunner came up with, is just like, what's some cool moves that you just want to do in the course? Like, what are some like cool ideas that you really want to do in series? Some like big swings, some big swings, and we just like pitch them out, whatever they might be. Like this, I thought this was cool. He'd be like, what are some magic tricks you've sort of seen in terms of like narrative sort of stuff? And people be like, let's do an episode that runs backwards, and let's do an episode that's like symmetrical, and like, let's like, and we just throw out like crazy ideas, and then what ends up happening is like idea Darwinism happens, and so we're like, oh, if we do this, like, like I remember literally my first thing I ever got on the board was, let's do an episode where I'm trying to think. It was did I come up with this? I don't remember if I came up with this first part, but I think there was a pitch where, for anyone who knows Marvel's Cloak and Dagger, Dagger goes into Cloak's cloak. Tandy goes into Tyrone's cloak, and I don't know if I came up with that pitch or someone else came up with that pitch. But if I didn't come up with that pitch, then I think that was already there. I think that was already the showrunners. But sort of my pitch was, when she does that, Tyrone doesn't have any of his powers, and he has to deal with something without having powers or something like that. And so that was like sort of a pitch, like things that we can do with the thing. I think my pitch at the time was like time moves faster there, or slower there than it does here. So she's gone for an hour, but he's waiting a week or something like that, and he's got a week without powers or something. But that was like one of my pitches, that sort of like the first pitch that kind of came on. And like, even if you look at that season, like we did sort of crazy stuff. Like we did one episode that's all alternative realities, and so we watch our main character going through all these like different versions of her life. And we did a version which was like one of our co-EPs, like White Whales, where he wanted to do a version where they jump into a video game. And so like we did an episode where they jump into a video game. And I'm trying to think what some of the other stuff that we did, but it was a lot of stuff like that. Just like, what are some big chances we wanted to take, and usually a good showrunner has like a little bit of a spine in terms of like, this is what I want the season to be about. Here are the goalposts that I want to hit, but like, come up with sort of idea in terms of what can we do, and all that. So it's always depends on the show, and it's kind of up to whoever's running the room to sort of focus it in terms of, and sometimes the showrunner says like, I need this, and then it's like, and then we kind of go from there.
So then when you're given like, you're going to do episode 6, go write it.
Yeah.
You bring it back. Does the whole room kind of go over it and
the
tear
way
it apart for you, or?
Well, the way we work is that we and every room works a little bit differently. It's like we break all the episodes together as a room. And so we have like the basic idea. So before anyone even gets an episode, we know the episode well enough to know what it's about, and sort of like we can write a page about what the episode, like what happens in the episode and what it's about thematically for the characters. So we all know that. And then once we have that, then again, this was for this particular show, the showrunner says, okay, you're writing that episode. You're writing this episode. And then I'm trying to think, I want to say, and so when that happens, when you're writing an episode, because then what you do in terms of a course of a season, then you kind of all talk about it in terms of the episode, like what happens in this episode, and what are some scene ideas and all that kind of stuff. And so once you get, in this particular case, like once you get your episode, you can talk about it. For me, I had a co-writer. We all had co-writers on that show, and we pot up and we kind of just come up with ideas for scenes and all that and all this kind of stuff. And then we present that to the room in terms of like, yeah, we can do this and not this and all that. And then we all kind of jam on it together.
Yeah, I'm always fascinated on that process because I talk to so many comics writers who go to a room and write the comic, and then here you go.
Yeah.
And
Right,
I mean,
right.
you're
It's a
an
very
editor, there's more
solitary
to that,
process.
but there's the collaborative process of writing has always been something that's been fascinating to me because it's just it's so
Yeah.
different from what is normally going on in other mediums.
Yeah, I think the thing about the collaborative process I find is that when it's working, it's so individualized and so specified to that project and to those people that every time it happens, you're just kind of like, oh wait, how do we do this again? Like you just don't. It's like so organic to the thing. It's
Yeah.
almost impossible to think of like what it's like when you don't have a thing to base it on.
So after that, at some point, you finish up Infidel. To go back to comics, you finish up Infidel. Is Good Asian the next book that you pitch, or is there something in between that I'm missing?
No, The Good Asian was the next book that I pitched. One of the challenges with that I'm trying to get better at, and we'll see if this actually works or not. But part of the challenge of juggling comics and TV at the same time is that, how do I keep both plates sort of spinning? And the goal was to do sort of a book a year. And what ended up happening was coming off of Cloak and Dagger, I got a ton of television work, and it was like back to back to back to back, which is usually everything that you want. And it still is everything that I want as a television writer. And I'm a bit better about it now, but when I was just starting out my career, I was still getting my sea legs and working in television. So like when I got a TV job, it was like I focus on that TV job. And even now, what I try to do is I try to start up a comics project right before a TV job, and then if I have time on the side, I'll write away the comics project. But I don't like to be like developing a new comics project while I'm in a TV job because it's just exhausting. It's too much of the same muscles that are happening. So as a result, I did some short stories along the way because I could squeeze them into my schedule. But no, Good Asian was, it took, I think, it was, what is it? Infidel came out in 2018. Good Asian was originally scheduled to come out in 2020, but then the pandemic happened, so we pushed it to 2021. So it took 2 to 3 years for for Good Asian to come out, and it's been my goal not to have it so long between books ever since. And the idea is as I get further up in television, I can pick and choose my jobs a little bit more, so I can squeeze in sort of like the comics.
Yeah. So real quick before we get too deep, because in case there's a new listener that hasn't heard me talk about Good Asian, let's give the pitch on Good Asian real quick.
Oh, sure. The Good Asian is a genre I'm calling Chinatown Noir. It's a 1936 detective story in the style of Sam Spade or Philip Marlowe, featuring the first generation of Americans that grew up underneath an immigration ban, the Chinese. It's kind of a Chinese American, one of America's first Chinese American detectives comes to San Francisco Chinatown in 1936 to look for a missing girl, and in classic noir style, he stumbles on a murder, he stumbles onto a conspiracy, and it's a way of looking into this community. It's a way of going into Asian American history that we don't really talk about, and to talk about this community that's kind of been lost in sort of history.
Yeah, when I first heard about this book, you pulled me in at noir. Like I am a huge Brubaker fan, so obviously I'm a huge noir fan. And when I read this first issue, and I think it was like the first couple of pages where you really give the backstory of what was happening at that time. And I literally afterwards went out and just researched a little bit because I'm like, how have I never heard of this?
Yeah.
And we've had a lot of conversation recently about different cultures in our country, but that is the Asian American culture and what they went through, especially during that era, there's no spotlight on it. And I love that comic, the thing that I was told growing up was like a waste of my time, put a spotlight on something like that. So how did you come across this story?
For me, it's kind of where it started for me. I self-identify as Thai American, even though I'm Chinese on my dad's side. And the reason why I self-identify as Thai American is because growing up in Thailand, the 5 years I was growing up in Thailand, whenever my mom and dad would have an argument about politics and my dad was losing, he would always end the argument, which is kind of like, that's a problem with you Thai people, and da-da-da. And my mom would always get pissed off, and she'd be like, you're Thai, what are you talking about? And he's like, no, I'm Chinese. And she's like, you don't speak Chinese, you've never been to China, like, don't stop it with that Chinese stuff, like, you're Thai. You're just as Thai as I am. And So when and my dad's later years, he became very obsessed with his Chinese roots. So anytime I would come to visit him,
Mhm.
he was watching some documentary about a Chinese dam. He was telling me about how the Chinese were going to inherit the earth, and China was like, no one could, compare to what China's doing. It was always China, China, China. And he was, and when he passed, like part of the process of dealing with, of processing that for me was to get into the stuff that he got into, which was his interest in China. And I think partly because my interest is so much about an Americana and pop culture, instead of like, I would have thought from the outside looking in, I would have been interested in like Chinese mythology or Chinese history, but instead I ended up getting interested in Chinese American history. And that's when I learned about the Chinese Exclusion Act. And that's when I learned about the Immigration Act of 1924. And like you, I was shocked I didn't know anything about it. And, especially as an Asian American man, like I didn't know anything about any of this stuff. I was never taught it. And because I had this sort of pop culture addled mind, the first thing, or one of the first things that came up was the idea is like, wow, it's so crazy that in the 1930s, there were characters like Charlie Chan and Mr. Moto and Mr. Wong Detective, and they were really popular. And that they were really popular despite Asians not being able to get into the country. Like it's such a contradiction. And then that's what came up with the idea is like, well, what if I did, an Asian crime solver story like in the style of those detectives, but was a little bit more true to the racial history of the time and kind of use a racial lens of today and apply it onto that story. And then, when we're doing like solo detective, like it just lent itself to noir so easily. So like it kind of fell into that genre almost immediately. And also I feel like American detective just instantly becomes noir. And so, and so that kind of is where the idea started. And then from there, it was just like doing all the research to really make sure like I was getting everything right.
Yeah, it's funny is the wrong word. It's fascinating that when I look back at my uh, education, like I was really this. I'm not just saying this because you're here. This book really made me think about a lot of things. And when I thought about my Asian American education, the only thing I could come back to was like Japanese internment camps.
Yeah.
It was as if like that happened, then we did nothing else to Asian people. Like it was all fine after that. And really loved, as much as I think the first time I read, my criticism of it was that it felt a little bullet pointy, but then going back at it, I was just like, I see why he had to do it that way, and I really appreciate that he had to do it that way. There's also the type of I'm losing my words. The type of cop you had in here, the lead character, the way he is. Can you explain that a little bit to people that may not know? Because I've heard you say it before, but
sure. So Edison Hark is very much inspired by Chang Aparna, who was also the inspiration for Charlie Chan. Was America's first Asian American cop. And he was a cop in Hawaii, because the first Asian American cop wouldn't happen in mainland America, wouldn't happen until around 1956 in San Francisco. So before then, the only time you could find an Asian American cop was in Hawaii. And for Chang Aparna, he by today's standards, he was considered a race traitor. He policed his own kind. He sent lepers out to, he sent lepers, which was seen. Leprosy was seen as a Chinese disease, and so he would round them up and send them off to Malachi. And that situation I found sort of fascinating, and I like this idea of a Chinese American cop who joins the force in the hopes of being the bridge for his community, proving that Asians were good enough to sort of be accepted, and then to find himself sort of weaponized against his community. And like, what is it like to be that person? And I feel like too, for all Asian Americans, or not all Asian Americans, but it's very common for Asian Americans to feel a push and a pull between their two cultures, the Asian and the American aspect of themselves. And because sometimes it does sort of feel like they're in conflict. Eastern culture is more about the community than the individual. Western culture is more about the individual. So when you're straddling both worlds, where do you sit between the two that doesn't feel like you're sort of betraying one? And so that's how it could kind of feel like internally. The thing I loved about Edison Hark was it took that internal conflict and it heightened it and made it very external. And so he's constantly having to choose, like, is his loyalty to the law and the country and this original intention that he had, this aspiration that he had of proving that, his people are worthy of assimilation, of worthy of being called Americans in sort of that model minority way. But then he's also torn by the fact that, by doing right, he's also hurting the people that he professed to want to help, that led him to the job. So that's kind of, who Edison Hark is at its core, trying to figure out, how Asian to be and how American to be sort of an Asian American. And it's very literalized in terms of him being this sort of like, now when we meet him, he's this burnt out cop who doesn't even know if change is possible in the world. And if anything can sort of like will change for him or his community.
With this character in the story, do you see doing more with him in the future, or is this a one-done story?
I'd love to do more with him in the future. A lot of it for me, I'm very superstitious, so a lot of it for me depends on how well the book does, and then it will probably. We'll see how long I would have if we do a book 2. I'm also as curious as everyone else. How long will it take to get a book 2 up and running? Just because it involves issues, the numbers for the first book coming in, and me being like, okay, was 10 issues the right number to do this? Should it be shorter? Should it be longer? Was this a mistake? Was that a mistake? And then hopefully with the data I get from that, I can kind of say like, okay, this is a way I can do it that feels like financially responsible. Whereas, the first book, I just did what was right for that story. And it was important for me for that story to exist and for that character to exist. But then to continue on, I have to be a little bit more judicious in terms of like, all right, what actually makes financial sense?
That's an interesting thing that we've actually talked about on the show, and I'm not going to name names because I don't want to tear down any creators, but there's certain creators that go on and do these like longer 12-issue things, and you're like, by issue 5 or 6 sometimes, just like, I'm over this.
Yeah,
I mean, it's just going to be tough for you guys to choose what number of issues, whether to really satisfy the story or so on.
It's really, and I kick myself all the time for, like, I don't know what the best number for a story could be, but I'm pretty sure 10 isn't it. Like, just in terms of, like, forget about the story, just in terms of, like, the financial model sort of for a book, I'm pretty sure 10 issues is not the best financial model for the book. If I had to guess, 5 or 6 issues is a great model. That's what we did Infidel with. But I could also see like 15 being a great model, because if you have a story that will tell that, like a long ongoing story, because then you're going into bookstores and you're giving them a volume 1 of X. With The Good Asian, we're just giving volume 1 of 2, and I there's a lot of times I'm thinking I'm doing the worst of both worlds, but by doing that, like, it's a little too long for, like, to get in and out, but it's not long enough to get like a bookstore to be like, oh, this is a good commitment for the future, so I'll buy a lot of books now. And so for this one, it really was about like, let's just do this story, let's do what's right for the story, and we'll just cross our fingers and hold our breaths and do everything we can to keep the book as exciting and as fresh and as relevant as we can be. But it's with this knowledge that, we did not, because and this is true, like, originally the book was 9 issues, and we felt like, no, we needed an extra issue to do the story justice. So we're not overly compressing things for the sake of numbers, but we're also not overextending things. I hope we're not overextending things. And part of my goal, and part of my editor, why Will Dennis, my editor, is so good at what he does, is to make sure that it's still as sort of fresh and as captivating with every issue. That there isn't, because I've read those comics too, where you're just like, oh, okay, like, to me, it's like. To me, I feel like you feel that when you're reading a comic, where you're just like, oh, I guess this will read better in a trade, and that's what I feel like you kind of like, you kind of failed in terms of your monthly, responsibility, so like that's part of it for me too. Is like, I want every issue to be exciting, and I want you to can't wait to buy the next issue, and I want you to feel like you got a meal in this issue.
Yeah. So, man, This book has been really good. I really hope the numbers do come back and you can do more, because it's been awesome.
Thank you.
I want to ask you, if you don't mind me asking, as an Asian American, what do you attest to, like, a lot of the uptick in kind of Asian American culture in America, And then how important is it to you that this stuff is starting to gain some popularity? I mean, we just came off Shang-Chi as a movie and all this.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's really important to me that it's, I think a lot of it has been happening that for a long time, Asian Americans have sort of been quiet. And that silence has been sort of for survival in many cases. And I think, this stuff was sort of, it certainly started with Crazy Rich Asians, and this stuff has sort of been getting a groundswelling there with just people. And it's the same thing that, led me to write The Good Asian is there's a history that hasn't been talked about, that's been overlooked. Yeah. And so it was the goal to sort of celebrate that history, highlight that history, and highlight sort of that presence. I mean, Asian Americans are the fastest sort of growing ethnicity, I think, in America, I believe, are the numbers that I've read. And so it makes sense that as that group grows, their capacity to buy things grow. And I think that's the main thing. Like, I think you're seeing a big audience for this now because, the people selling this stuff is realizing, oh, if we sell stuff marketed to this group, there's enough to make a blip in terms of what we need in terms of our financial returns. And so if that wasn't happen, I don't think any of this would sort of gain traction. And because Lord knows there's been attempts to do this before in the past, and they've all kind of quieted down. This feels like it's going to last a little bit longer, and hopefully it will sort of become mainstream. And so for me, yeah, it's really important to sort of see all this sort of stuff happening and all that. And it's also interesting too because, and it's part of one of the challenges when I was writing the book is that Asian American, if you look at Latino Americans, right, there are many different Latino Americans encompass people from many different countries, and it's not a monolith. And the only thing they really have in common, is that is language, is the language that they speak. But if you look at Asian Americans, they're just as varied, and they don't even have language to hold them together. So they're even more varied in that particular way. And so part of the project and part of the goal of talking about Asian Americans is just realizing how varied and how diverse Asian Americans sort of are, and sort of that sort of history. And again, I also feel like, and this is where I'm sort of coming from in terms of like where I'm writing The Good Asian and all that. There's something fascinating in the history of Asian Americans. There's something fascinating where, Asian American, the term Asian American has happened in the 1960s. And before that, people weren't considered Asian. They were considered, if they were Chinese, were considered Oriental or Japanese or Filipino. And, in the 1960s, they came up with this term Asian American to link all these groups that some had similarities, some didn't. A lot of them had animosities and conflicts with one another. But for sort of their survival, their political survival, they gave themselves a term and lumped themselves together. And I think in that story, there's that's the story of America in a nutshell. And so I do think that by looking at the history of Asian America and Asian America, you look at the history for America, and given how fractious the country is right now, like I do think that it's a potential pathway to the future of America as well.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me watching this happen. I know so many people that are fans of Asian cinema or kung fu movies, as they're called.
Yeah,
and I actually, like myself, you can tell behind me, I grew up with a lot of Japanese influence. There's manga all around me. There's Pokemon. There's video games. So it's fascinating that I always grew up with like this all around me, and now like the rest of the world's kind of, at least the rest of the country is kind of catching up with a lot of the stuff, and it's been cool to watch. I'm glad to see that representation going all the way around to everybody, and some amazing creators and characters and everything coming out of it. Yourself, I've been gushing left and right about Gene Luen Yang.
Oh god, he's great.
And so on and so forth. So it's been really cool to watch it happen in the past couple of years. Probably the past decade, actually. But no,
it's been really great. It's been really great, and it's sort of exciting to watch. And it still feels like you're kind of on the ground floor or something, so that feels exciting too. So it's been really cool.
Yeah, it's been cool for my co-host Mike, who's out of town right now. But normally he does these with me, and he's been such a big fan of Asian cinema,
Oh,
and
that's
now
cool.
like everybody's coming to him being like, so like Shang-Chi,
Right.
how is it?
Yeah.
But yeah, so Pornsak, thank you so much for doing this. It was great chatting with you. If everybody wants to follow you a little bit further, where's the best place to send them?
I am on Twitter at real_Pornsak, and I'm on Instagram at real_Psac. So you can follow me at both of those places.
And Good Asian is still coming out monthly at comic shops everywhere, correct?
Yes, that is correct. Our trade collecting the first 4 volumes, if you've missed out so far, is coming out on September 29th, which is the same date issue 5 will be coming out. So you can kind of use it to swoop in to catch up with the rest of the series if that's your want.
Yes, Image is always really great about that.
Yeah.
So everybody, go follow Pornsak further. Go read The Good Asian and Infidel, and check out everything else he's doing, because it's all good stuff. Pornsak, thank you so much once again.
Thank you, man. This is super fun.
Yeah, we'll have to do it again sometime.
Absolutely.